Hello everyone, I'm Supriya Sharma from Hindustan Times and I'm at the Jaipur Literature Festival, and today I'll be talking to Aanchal Malhotra, who's the author of Remnants of a Separation. Hello Aanchal, welcome to our Facebook Live.
Hi, thank you. Nice to be here.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Aanchal and her book before we start talking. Aanchal is an artist and oral historian, and her book Remnants of a Separation looks at the partition through objects that refugees carried with them across the border. So, actually, you're talking about partition through personal objects. And it's such a simple yet brilliant idea. Like, nobody thought of it before. Like, what made you think of it?
I didn't begin this research with the purpose of writing a book, but when I encountered two objects that belonged to my own family that had been carried from Lahore to Amritsar, first of all, I was shocked that I had never seen these objects, mostly because they were so mundane. It was a ghada, a vessel, and a guz, a yardstick. And it amazed me that I didn't know about these two objects, and so many years had passed and we still had them. But the other thing that amazed me was the person that they belonged to, my grandfather's brother. When he talked about them, when he touched them, caressed them, he seemed to be absolutely transported to another landscape, which was pre-partition, a landscape of undivided India. And he started telling us कि लस्सी ऐसे बनाते थे इसमें, गज हम ऐसे इस्तेमाल करते थे. And when the resurgence of that kind of memory happened, I just thought it was such a novel idea to extract otherwise traumatic memory of partition. If we can get into the concept of partition in a gentler way through objects, maybe it's a more interesting and easier way to extract that memory. And so it started a 4-year-long exercise in, extraction of memory from people of India and Pakistan and England about the things they'd left behind and the home they had left behind.
In your book, you speak to people, like you said, from India and Pakistan and England, and there are so many stories in the book that come out of people just remembering these simple everyday objects, be it a shawl or a pair of scissors. So how did you find these people?
I wish I had some organized system of finding people, but at the beginning, I think also the idea of the book was so strange that people didn't understand why I wanted to look at the things rather than just speak to them about memory of migration. And so I would say that the initial first year of finding objects was literally like foraging. If my family helped me a lot. If they saw someone old and they just looked like, how do you look like you crossed the border? But it was basically like this, if they saw someone old, they would just be like, wahan se aaye the, kuch laye the. Or my aunt would go for walks in Delhi, and she has this walking group of older women, and she would say, acha ye jhumke wahan se hain, will you talk to my niece? And then word of mouth, this kind of stuff grows quite organically. There's no archive that you can refer to about objects. So it grew very organically. I started collecting organically, and it really became that I have this friend who has this grandmother who has this trunk, or my uncle, someone has these letters, come see them. And very, very slowly, objects of age started to come out from cupboards, and, the dust was cleaned off of them, and I started collecting like that.
And like finding people in India would be relatively easier compared to doing it across the border in Pakistan. So how did you make that work?
Well, one would think so, but actually finding people in Pakistan was quite easy for me. I worked as a short-term researcher with the Citizens Archive of Pakistan, and they very meticulously have that kind of list, especially people that migrated from India to what became Pakistan. They put me in touch with people that might have carried things with them through their interviews. So it was easier because there was not that sense of foraging there. It was really like an interview was set up for me. I did go and talk to the person, and if by chance they referred me to another person, that also became a part of my archive. But incidentally, it was easier in Pakistan than in India. But also
that's surprising.
The vastness of India, the sheer vastness, the sheer diversity of experience, what kind of object you're going to get from where, depending on how someone migrated and when they migrated and what circumstance they migrated in, it's so expansive. India's way more expansive. So I think in that, the complexity of finding things was much more in India as well.
Something I found common in all the stories and all the accounts is that almost everybody is surprised that the Batwara actually happened. You know, they tell you that we never thought this would happen, but it happened. So while you're talking to people, you know, they're recollecting painful memories. So was it? How did you like? Was it easy to get them to open up?
No. No, and if you think about it, there was such a difference between the generation that I was speaking to and my generation. Age difference, you're crossing that boundary as well. You know, you're trying to, of course, cross that man-made border to the other side to ask them about things, but you're also crossing the border of age, of gender, of asking the question that, the unaskable questions. You know, for the first time, I was not the vulnerable one, they were, right? And that's a really difficult thing to understand. Someone who is so much older than you, you have the ability to make them vulnerable and make them feel pain that they don't want to feel. So it was difficult, and it was difficult for me and so much more difficult for them. But the thing, by asking the question, I did it by asking the question, and I asked and I asked and I asked, and it's difficult and it's prodding and it feels like you're forcing. मुझे बताओ, मुझे डिटेल में बताओ, ट्रेन में गए थे तो ट्रेन में क्या था, कितनी सीट थी, कौन सी सीट ऊपर थी, खून था कि नहीं था, औरतें थी कि नहीं थी, सामान था कि नहीं था. But you just have to ask, because I think I belong to a generation, I think we both do, third generation. We have inherited these fragments of memory, but there is nothing to put it together. There's no thread to sew it together. And until you don't have these details, this meat, this information, how are you going to cohesively put together your collective history, right? It was very difficult to ask and continue to ask. And it was even harder to hear what they were saying. But I think I wasn't going to wait around for someone else to do it. You know, it just had to be done, because our future generation will be richer for this knowledge. Yes, it's horrific and violent, and it causes so much pain. And, you know, it's like a stagnation of memory had happened for a long time. Nobody talked about any of these things. And the other thing is, when you ask someone something like this, I always like to think of it as a plateau. You're asking someone to arrive at a place of vulnerability. Well, you have to do the same. And for that, it takes time and it takes trust. Once you build that trust, you can ask the unaskable questions, right? But that trust-building exercise took so much time and so much, you know, random, mundane things that we talked about. But it's worth it. Because in the end, if you can break through from those walls and actually extract the raw memory that they haven't thought about for 70 years, well then, that's your purpose. It's been met. You know?
Memory can also be an unreliable narrator. So how did you negotiate that?
You have to take some things for face value. And the sheer magnanimity of Partition allows us to expect these versions of history, right? Partition history has versions, and everyone's version is different. And I think if somebody remembers something in a particular way, even if it might not be accurate, then we have to take that memory at face value, because that's the way they remember it. And you have to understand that, yes, memory is unreliable and memory is malleable, and it stretches, it expands, it changes. You know, collective memory becomes personal memory so fast. So even if you haven't seen anyone being killed or haven't seen riots, because everyone else around you is talking about it, of course you're going to say, हाँ मैंने भी देखा था. Because that's how people remember. You know, that's how they associate. What I did do, and which is important for me to do, is to corroborate as many memories as I can. So if somebody said something like, in January 1930, I saw Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru on the banks of the river Ravi declare Poon Swaraj, and I was 4 years old and I saw it in Lahore, well, that's something that I can find in an archive as well. And it became very important for this book not to just be a book of memory, to be a book of fact and memory. So there is a lot of academic information in there that supplements oral history, because academic history and oral history cannot exist in isolation from one another.
Your book is, the book has a lot of amazing stories, okay, be it about these instances where people from different communities helped each other in the time of this madness, or something like the love story of Prabjot Kaur, or the lady whose Guru Granth Sahib was preserved by the new owners of the Muslim family that moved into her house. There's so many wonderful stories. And so is there one particular story or incident that has stayed with you during this project that you can still remember and impacts you?
There's so many, because over 4 years, if you spend any amount of intimate time with people, they become kind of like your family. Incidentally, one of my favorite stories from the book is a story that has no objects. It's chapter 10 and it's titled The Hopeful Heart of Nazmuddin Khan. And it's a story from Delhi, it's from Hauz Rani, and Nazmuddin Khan's father used to work for the Viceroy as his security. So he used to live in Viceroy House, which is now Rashtrapati Bhavan, of course. And I went to see Mr. Khan with the naive assumption that I would be shown some security papers or some newspaper clipping or maybe a photograph of Jinnah or something, something about that. And when I arrived there, I was given nothing. There was no object at all. And all through our interview, I kept looking around for these objects, and there was just such a sense of smallness then, because he was talking to me about something much larger and I was looking around for objects. And in this particular moment, the book becomes very self-reflective, and almost you start questioning, because at one point you're asking people about migration and displacement. On the other hand, you are asking people about frivolities like things. So there was a duality in me as well, and this interview made it very clear. So I am looking around for things and I'm not getting anything, and all I'm being met with is silence. And then he starts to tell me the awful massacres of Muslims that happened in Delhi, and he describes them in great detail to an extent that he says, बंटवारे के कई साल बाद मुझे ऐसा लगा था कि मेरे हाथों की जो खुशबू है वो उसी दिन की तरह थी जब मुसलमानों को मारा गया था. अभी भी मुझे लगता है, I can smell it on my hands, I can feel it. It was very visceral, and he remembered everything. And then he said to me, why do you think Muslims don't belong in India? And I said, I don't think that. And he said, I'll tell you a story. Hindus are born in India, they live in India, they die in India, and when they die, you cremate their ashes and you put them in the Ganga, and if the Ganga goes out of India and into international waters, the ash also goes. Muslim person is born in India, they live and they work and they die in India, and then you bury them in the ground, and at some point their body decomposes and becomes India, the soil that you're walking on right now. How can you say such a person doesn't belong in this land? And it was such a simple thing. He wasn't trying to give me any gyan. He was just telling me, hey, you're looking for objects, but I'm trying to teach you something here. This sense of secularism that he was trying to hold on to, I thought that it was so much bigger than any object he could have shown me. So much more important, and it was so much heavier. The book is about all of these heavy things, and the object just acts as a trigger. Right? It acts as a catalyst. It's almost like you're using it like a shovel, like an archaeologist digs. You're using the object as a shovel to extract, to excavate. But what he was trying to teach me was something so much greater than that. And so the book has things like this in it as well. He's in Delhi, yeah.
There is a point of view that, and this came up during a session also yesterday, that while you are excavating, you're also making people recollect their very painful things. Like, we have to forget the past to move on, right? So is it really essential to talk about this and bring this back again?
It's interesting you say that we have to forget the past to move on, because I would say you have to remember the past to move on. You should know it, right? Learn from it, understand it. I don't think partition is a closed subject, because there's been decades of silence. The partition memory has not just it has just not come out. It's actually just entombed. It's been almost coffinated into silence. And I mean, it was only in the 80s or 90s that people started to talk about it, and even that was in closed quarters, privately. Memorialization must be an active practice in every household. Young children, people younger than me, don't know where their ancestors came from. It might be fine right now when their grandparents are alive, but in about a decade's time, it won't be the case anymore. We will not be we won't have any knowledge of where we come from, and so it's very important to have these conversations, even more so important if your family genealogy begins on the other side of the border, to be able to trace. There is nothing more empowering than knowing your own family history. We must be proud keepers of that history, which we are not yet. We're not yet. So I think only by remembering, by talking, yes, it's a very painful process, but at some point it is also a process of lightening yourself. In many instances, when I was recording interviews with people, I did feel like, it felt like, okay, I'm giving you this very, very painful thing that happened to me. Now it's your responsibility. Keep it. And then I became the depository of all these things. I started to hold them, talking about them, keeping them safe. Right? And a sense of responsibility comes with that, but also a sense of knowledge. And I think it's very important to continue to talk about these things so that we can normalize them. So that we can accept, we can move on, but conversation is important for that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have often wondered how did those people deal with all the trauma? Like, you didn't have therapists, you didn't have...
And I said this yesterday in my session as well, but it took me... I did an interview in January of this year because, even though the book has come out, my research has continued. I conducted an interview with a woman in January, and it took me, I swear, 5 years, hundreds of interviews, and one book later to hear this thing from someone. She said that the only reason we were able to live through partition was because of our parents. There was such an enormous sense of support. But they also made us feel like partition was something normal, and we just had to get on with it like it was something normal, which it wasn't. The sheer normalization of it at that point, I think this prevented a lot of people from talking about the sheer uprootedness of their lives, what migration had done to them. And then there were so many other things to think about. How do you feed yourself? How do you feed your family? What job do you do? Where do you get money from? You're living in a camp, in a tent with another family with no sanitation. There are hundreds of things you need to worry about. It was difficult, and nobody had the luxury to ponder on things like displacement. And it's true for my own family as well.
Right. For those who are watching, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you have questions, just post them in the comments below. Another thing, Aanchal, that I noticed while reading the book, the importance of language. Like while recording these oral histories, you're very careful to, note how a particular word has been pronounced, especially if it's in a regional language, and the lilt and everything. So would you like to talk about that?
Sure. That was a very conscious decision on my part because I noticed it with so many people. And this is like the fun part of writing, that you can do these things. And a little bit of humor comes into these subjects as well because this subject is so serious. So, for instance, there's a story in my book about Prabjot Kaur, who's, of course, this incredibly prolific Sahitya Academy award-winning poet. And she's telling me, I'm from Langreal. And I say, Langreal. And she goes, Langreal. And so I'm made to repeat that. And I find it so comical. But I write it exactly how it is because she stressed on it so much. The other thing I'm very conscious of is the fact that not all languages translate well into English. I happen to be a writer who's most proficient in the English language. But of course, there are some things that only vernacular can express fully. For instance, someone from Pakistan said to me, she's telling me about how she will never forget the partition of India. Now, in my book, I write it in Urdu and in English. But in English, I will never forget the partition of India. But in Urdu, she really says, मैं वो तक़सीम हिंद भुला नहीं पाऊंगी. And but the essence of loss, वो तक़सीम हिंद भुला नहीं पाऊंगी, I will never be able to forget it. There is a sense of longing in that. It's more haunting. That's exactly what it is. And maybe it's my romanticizing of vernacular language. But I just think also putting things in a book that people have said in the language that is most closest to them also teaches us about that particular land. We identify ourselves through our food, our last names, and through the language we speak. And it's easy to say, you speak this language, you must be from here. It identifies you to a place. And what we're really trying to do is get a sense of that undivided landscape where people were from. And I think I've tried my best to put in even languages I don't understand, like Bangla. the last chapter is in Bangla, and there are so many lines I didn't understand, but it was how they spoke. They spoke in Bangla. And when they were talking to each other, 5 minutes of Bangla would only translate to 1 minute of English. And I thought to myself, I'm missing something here. But it was important for me to put it in Bangla as they said it, because that is the most comfortable language that they had between them. Yeah.
It's been wonderful talking to you, Aanchal.